How many of you can't stand your carburetor problems on your Chevette? I know I can't. I absolutely can't stand a carburetor. It doesn't work very well. So here we're going to start on part one of a multi-part series going over this carburetor and some fixes. So here we are. Alright, well, a few things that can be considered before you're ever tearing your carburetor off is, if you're unfamiliar with it and you're going to try and put it back as stock as possible, label everything. Be it colors, tags, whatever, label it. Most of it will only go back one way, but in some cases it's very easy to confuse things like vacuum lines and placements, and some electrical connectors will go in multiple locations, things like that. In this particular car's case, a lot of this has been deleted simply just to get it running, because this was dead for a long time, and when I found it, it was just full of vacuum leaks and none of the emissions equipment was working. So we're going to get into tearing this apart here. This one has a non-stock air cleaner on it. However, it's just an aftermarket Weber air cleaner on the factory air cleaner rubber down here that goes underneath the factory round air lid. So there's nothing particularly special about it, and it just simply comes off this way. Your stock one will just come off with the butterfly screws. And just like that, we're down to just the stock carburetor. Now, your 79 and 1980 carburetors in the US and all carburetors in Canada were pre-feedback, meaning they did not have a throttle position sensor on them, and they did not have a curb idle enrichment. They also were lacking a couple of the additional vacuum ports that this car has for the emissions devices. So there'll be some slight differences for the Canadians, but otherwise it's all basically the same. As a matter of fact, your accelerator pump is underneath this 4-bolt spot right here. There's another screw here. The previous carburetors had a throttle position sensor less cover, so this wasn't here. It was just a normal cover with the arm on it, and they added this so the emissions computer knew where your throttle was at, so it could tailor accordingly. It's the same procedure to get at that accelerator pump. If you were to need to, say, try to get this engine running in the field, and you knew the fuel bowl was full of fuel, but when you rocked the throttle, you didn't get the characteristic spray of fuel. This one barely does, as you can see it there. You can do the accelerator pump externally without having to tear the carburetor apart. So that'll get you going. Obviously, to get into this carburetor to adjust float settings or to clean it out, you would need to pull the top off, and that requires all of the screws around the top of the base plate and the fuel line to be removed. And then on the later carburetors that have the feedback solenoid, this needs to be removed first, and then the linkage for the choke needs to come off, and the whole top comes off. The base can stay in the car, and everything on the carburetor can be serviced here on the car. Now, we're not going to do that today because this carburetor needs to come off and be boiled or pressure cleaned, because there's a ton of junk inside some of the passages on the primary side. This car only runs on the accelerator pump and the secondary, and this is a vacuum secondary, so you can imagine where my foot's at most of the time driving it around right now. Wide open, and while it does okay, it could do better. So we're going to go ahead and take it off of here. I'm going to go ahead and get some tools, and I'll be right back. All right, so just for camera purposes, I've already loosened some of these things, but a couple of things you want to check when you are bringing one of these things back from the dead is that the base nuts are actually tight. A lot of times what happens is this is your first initial huge vacuum leak, is that the carburetor just simply has loosened up and it's just sitting here loose on the intake. Sometimes you can just run the nuts down snug and that'll solve a lot of the problem. When you are removing the fuel line, as you notice, this one's chewed up from previous people. The idea is to hold your fuel filter housing still while you break this loose with a line wrench, or if you do not have a line wrench, a snug fitting 1/2 inch to get on that tube nut solid so it'll crack loose. Reason for that is, if you do not, you'll turn this, which will twist the line, and it'll unscrew right there at the top of the carburetor. And then you're really screwed, because then the line gets twisted. And you can see this one has had a little twist in it. I've since straightened it back out and managed to get the tube nut prettied up enough to thread into another one of these, because somebody had been monkeying with it. And I think vice grips have been involved, possibly. That's usually how I find them. Vice grips have just chewed the hell out of these things. But at any rate, this comes off and just comes out of the way. You can get to these two nuts with a wrench to get them loose, and then you'll spin them off with your fingers. This comes off with the carburetor. Unhook your vacuum line here. It's easier than trying to remove the vacuum line from here or the PCV valve. A lot of times the PCV valve has been taken out of its grommet, and the grommet's rock hard, so nobody puts it back in there, so it just pops out. And then you have your two nuts back here that hold it down, and then this whole unit just comes right up off of there. I'll show you here in just a second. Before I pull it up off of here, I did not loosen this one because I wanted to show you. Let's see if I can get in there. Maybe. Yeah, you can get the box end in there on that nut and break it loose. So let me get this broke loose here. They're 13 millimeter. Everything on this car is metric, by the way. So I know I said 1/2 inch on the tube nut, but that's because 1/2 inch fits it snug enough that it's not a problem. And a stick magnet comes in handy here when you can't get your long fingers in there. If you have short sausage fingers, you're not going to get them in there to get that, and you'll risk dropping it into the intake, bringing it up with the carburetor. So get yourself a stick magnet. You can just reach down in there and grab that nut. I believe I have these done back here. Now this looks like it's packed in here. It looks like, especially on the later model cars that had the emissions control stuff that's all over it, it really ends up looking more like a job than it is. The big thing is, once you get the air filter off and you get a couple vacuum lines out of the way, the rest of this really is just like the older cars, and it is very simple. Not a whole lot to it. And you just rock it till it comes up off of there. Now you'll see on this car still has its factory heating element in the carburetor gasket. And you're going to notice when I put this back together, this does not go back in this car. And there's a couple reasons for that. If you notice, this is already starting to come apart. I clipped that off before I even started to get this car running, and pulled the pigtail out of the plug, because these are a problem. They're ceramic material. It gets hot, it falls apart, goes down through the engine, and the engine ingests it. Or the flip side of this is it carbons up, and then it carbons this whole side shut. This is a fairly low mileage car. so it didn't have a chance to fall apart yet, but you see it was getting there. So these get chucked in the trash, and a Felpro base gasket that they sell for every Chevette now, as the replacement base gasket, is thick like this, but the whole center is open. It's a 6500 part number. I think I have. I'll get it, but this is a problem, and these don't go back on. This was an archaic emissions thing for cold weather only. It's saying the only time this was active was for the first couple minutes the car was running in an extreme cold temperature. The vast majority of us wouldn't need this, but because GM had to make it work for all 50 states, this is what they got. So yeah, that's gone, and this leaves you with the intake. Now, do not leave this open, because if you have to walk away from it for a little while, you run the risk of junk falling down in there, critters getting in here, all kinds of stuff. You can see my accelerator pump obviously was working pretty well, 4 or 5 pumps, and I've got a soaked intake manifold. That's typically what you want when the accelerator pump works. If it doesn't, you won't get any spray, and then even if it does start and run, it'll fall on its face every time you go to hit the throttle, and then it'll recover, or it won't recover and it'll just die. And that's a symptom of not only vacuum leaks, but also that accelerator pump being bad. It's just a diaphragm with a spring underneath of it. There's 4 Phillips head screws on the side of that, and this plate and arm come off, the diaphragm comes off, and then the spring comes out, and you put it back together, reverse or removal. In just a little bit, we're going to tear that apart, and I'll show you how to go through that. That's usually how I cover them right there. Just put a rag in the intake. All right, so now I got it inside here, and we're getting ready to tear it apart. I'm going to go over a couple things that we're going to not only see on both of these examples here, but things you need to check to verify whether the carburetor is even rebuildable or not. In this case, it's not bad enough, particularly the throttle shaft bore wear. This particular case, it's not bad enough that I'm going to worry about it too much. The big thing is the primary side just needs to function again, and the car will run fine. It did great up until I sucked some junk off the bottom of the tank and put some fresh gas in it and clogged her right up. So this is what you're going to get in the majority of your kits. This is not a full kit for the later carburetor. This is a full kit for this earlier carburetor. This is our 79 and up through 80 US and 79 through 87 Canadian, because Canadian cars didn't get the electronic feedback stuff. As you'll notice, on older carburetors, they will not have this bit right here. They also have, like I was saying earlier, a normal cover for the accelerator pump, and these will interchange. So if you were really just wanting to backdate this one a little bit and you wanted to get rid of that, you could just take that cover off, put it over there. Why you would want to do that, I don't know, but if you're in a situation where if this is the only thing that you can work with and you got to adapt, and you might as well do away with it if you have one. So at any rate, you're typically going to get parts for, this is where what they call the needle and seat. This is what controls the fuel flow. As it comes in through the inlet, it goes up through here, and then there's a float in there attached. That float operates that needle, and when it's full, it seats into the bottom of that with that little tip. Well, that little tip gets wore out, and sometimes this will hang up. So anytime you're in there, even if you don't think it needs it, change it. You got it in the kit, there it is. And I'll show you where that goes once we get this apart. It goes into the top part of this carburetor here. If you're working with a later model carburetor, like this one, you'll see that there looks to be an additional jet right here. This is the enrichment. This is where your power valve sits right above it. That's what this thing does. These later model carburetors don't really have a power valve per se. It's a metered full rich condition. And then the ECU tailors back fuel per the oxygen sensor and the engine temperature or engine coolant temperature sensor to meet the tailpipe needs. It really was just emissions control. And I'll go over that a little bit more. These will function unplugged, and I'll explain why. But back to this. When you are replacing this, you'll take it out, and you're going to see you get a new one. And you also get a new seal for the bottom of it. And then you've got this deal that gets a little spring on the bottom of it. And what happens is, as you see, that's tapered, just like the needle and seat for the float is. It rides up and down on the bottom of that. This is your power valve. And it sits something like this, just above that. And when there's vacuum applied, when the engine's running, it pulls this up. And when you nail the throttle, the vacuum disappears, this drops, and it pushes that open. And it lets an unmetered, well, metered, but not through the jets. This is a secondary port. It lets a raw amount of fuel through another passage in addition to the jets, and enriches the fuel so it doesn't stumble and fall on its face. Something else your accelerator pump does. This gives you that little pump shot I was telling you about. When you start the car or when you smash the throttle, you'll get a quick jet of fuel, because it'll push in here, which rides a little bit of fuel up through and into this deal through passages in this body, and then it squirts a tiny little bit of fuel down through there to get over the stumble that you would normally have if you didn't have that first shot. So it's important that these are working. Most often what happens is when these sit, this rubber, it deteriorates and it ends up cracking the first time you hit the throttle. So if you're going to bring one back from the dead, before you get to where you're smashing the throttle to see if it's got anything, go through the top of the carburetor. There's a vent like right here, or you can pull this out and pour a little fuel down in there. Or if you're working with the older one, definitely have to go through the air horn. But you want to pour a little fuel in here and get this full and let it sit for a little while. That'll kind of let this stuff soak. So if it is going to work for a little while, that's your best chances to get it wet again. Otherwise, like I said, it just tears. There's not a whole lot to doing a carburetor rebuild. You just have to make sure that when you take it apart, you put it back together in the exact same way you took it apart. Because it's easy to get jets and these air bleeds. Yeah, jets down here and these air bleeds up here. You can get them flip-flopped. That'll give you some really bad running conditions. It'll run real rich at first, and then it'll try to lean out on you when you get into the throttle. And then it'll recover, but it won't be happy at all, so don't get that stuff mixed up. What I like to do is mark which side of the carburetor I'm working on. And like this stuff here, if I take it out of here, it goes over here. This stuff here, it goes over here. That way I don't get it mixed up and it goes back in. Same thing with when you take like the pump jet squirter out right here. There's a seal under the screw and there's a seal underneath. There's also a spring and a ball in there that you don't want to lose. I believe there's new ones in here. Yeah, there's one of the balls right there. Now there's also some new plastics for the choke linkage, and the choke. These 3 longer screws right here, if you're working with a factory choke, it's set and they're broke off. So you cut the heads of them off, and then you should be able to just about grab the remains with your fingers or a pair of needle nose pliers and unscrew that. Those are the replacement screws for that. There's also some other choke parts in here. See, there's the separator plate for right in here, and then there's some choke seals and like the choke kickoff, or right here, the pull off. There's gaskets for that, as well as when the body of this comes off the side of the carburetor. Right here, there's an O-ring. Yeah, a lot of people forget that O-ring, and then it ends up with a vacuum leak when they put them back together. That would be that one right there. And then of course there's a gasket in here for the air horn for the choke pass through. So it's all here, and it's all usually outlined in the manual that comes with this. You see, this one's for the earlier 5200, not the 6000 series. And then this is the base gasket I was talking about. This is the replacement that you'll be using. You can't get the heater element anyway, so this is the proper replacement. This is what comes in the kits, which is a paper thin gasket. Some models that use this carburetor use this gasket. They use this carburetor on a lot of other things besides the Chevette, but the Chevette, you have to get this on its own separately, and I'll post the part number for this Velcro gasket here. They're cheap. This is like, I think it's like $4 or $5 or so, but they have limiting rings in them, so you can't over tighten this. And I will go over putting that on there, because there is a retorque that you're going to need to do after a few miles. Make sure that that actually seats, otherwise you'll end up with more vacuum leaks again. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and tear the top of this off, and I'll show you how that all comes apart, and then we'll start getting into things that you need to look for, specifically where vacuum leaks start on these. Alright, here, and I've already taken out the 2 screws for the enrichment solenoid, and it has a little O-ring on the bottom of it and a gasket underneath of it there that seals it to the top of the carburetor. A lot of times it's stuck. So if you can get like a pick in this area, right in here, and get up underneath of it, once you start rocking it, you can kind of help walk it up out of there. It just needs a little leverage to get past the O-ring. And then you're going to take these screws out, and you're going to make sure that your linkage down in here, I don't know if I can zoom in there. Let's see if I can get the light on it. Yeah, the linkage that goes through, you want to push it off of its plastic clip on the back of that choke there. It has the same type of plastic clip here as it does down here. Sorry, the lighting's terrible. Once that's off, this whole top of the carburetor will come up off of there. Now, if you're careful, you can get it off of there and reuse the gasket. Carburetor gaskets are vastly reusable. As long as they're not torn, they'll always reseal. Once you take this loose, if it doesn't just come right up, come loose, you can kind of give it little taps, and you'll kind of hear the gasket give you a little crack noise. You'll notice it separate. Once it's separated, then you can pull it off, and you'll get the float with the carburetor. So I'm going to get this broke loose here. Give me just a second, because I'm working one-handed right now. Alright. Whoa! So, just come straight up with it. If you feel it hanging up on something, just stop. Take a look, because it's probably the float hanging up on the gasket. And when you turn this upside down, this is what you're going to see. Now typically, these have a solid float. They don't need to be replaced if they're fresh. They do, however, fill up with fuel over time if they get pinholes in them. So the fact that they don't, the rumor that they don't sink like brass floats when they get wore out, that's untrue. Especially with the alcohol content today's fuel has, it'll put pinholes in the outer coating of this that allows the cells to be closed off and not retain liquid. That ends up opening up a porous like area, and it's kind of like a sea sponge, and it just pulls all kinds of moisture in. So what then ends up happening is these sink. This one actually needs replaced, and that may be part of my problem, but I have another one I'm going to rob out of another carburetor out in the garage. For the most part, when you go to remove these, this pin is kind of wedged in there, but it should come out fairly easy. You're going to pull your pin, and if you don't want to do it with your fingers, do it with a pair of needle nose pliers, but it should come out fairly straightforward. And then you're going to take your float and pull it out. And see here, that's that needle. And you see this has had some water in it. You see the rusty line on it. So this carburetor definitely has some junk in it. And then there's your seat. And it differs a little bit in design from what I've got in the kit here, but it still functions the same. And it just unscrews. That's pretty much all you're going to deal with here, other than blowing through some of these ports with carb cleaner or brake parts cleaner. And then on to here, be the same deal. If you can be really careful, you can get the gasket off, and it's reusable. I don't know. Oh, looky there. Oh, nope, see? This one's slightly different. I can use it as long as everything up here lines up. I can just trim that off or leave it there, but I don't technically have the right gasket here. So if I needed to, I could reuse that. So we'll set that aside. And as you can tell, there's a little bit of sediment down in here. I'm going to stir it up and you can see it. You see it coming up in the fuel. That's what we're going to be cleaning out of this carburetor, and that is actually probably hard packed into a couple of these passages, which is why it's going to get boiled. So I'm going to get to tearing this apart a little bit further, and then I'll go over a couple more things with you as it's coming apart, and we'll get ready to get the choke housing off of it, and we'll get into how to diagnose these. We're going to go into how to diagnose all the vacuum pots that are on these. But as of right now, I'm going to get this drained, and then I'm going to show you guys the two places that are really common for super bad vacuum leaks on these, and we'll determine whether you're going to go any further with your rebuild. And then that's going to be the end of part one, because I could go on for 2 or 3 more hours with this video, but I want to keep them a little bit short and broke up so they're not so monotonous. Let me get this a little bit further apart here, and then I'll go over the last couple things I took apart, and we'll get into showing you those vacuum leaks. So give me just a second. Okay, now a couple things here. The biggest thing is across the body of this thing. They have a really bad time right in this area developing a warp, or right out here. A lot of that is from just over torquing them, especially at the base nuts. The problem is you have to really take this thing completely apart to plane that flat again. And then you run the risk of the air horn not being flat. And the problem with the air horn not being flat is you can't plane it flat. There's no way to get that off of there to plane it flat. So you have to almost hope that this part's okay, and that the carburetor's body itself took the brunt of the work. And a lot of your remanufactured carburetors, if you're not working with a factory one, the remans, they just plane these flat. And sometimes they'll even go as far as to take sandpaper to the air horn to flatten out an area and hopes that the gasket's going to make up the difference. And that's really a bad thing. One other thing besides that is the base. The base of these carburetors works really badly, and especially with a remanufactured carburetor, they'll take and just put them on a belt sander, and sometimes they take so much off of one side, there's no way to fix them. And yeah, it's comical how many I see that way. So if you're working with a remanufactured carburetor, check those two areas first. Make sure they don't have evidence of being sanded. It'll be obvious. One other thing that gets every single one of these, because they're so thin here and here where the throttle shaft runs, they develop a warp, and it's usually because the throttle return spring has been too heavy, or somebody's not lubricated the linkages, and it's pulling really hard in one direction. It ends up wearing into the carburetor down here. The fix for that would normally be to remove the throttle shaft and then bore the carburetor and put bushings in it, which you can do. As a matter of fact, quadrajet bushings work perfect for these because of the 8mm shafts, and the carburetor does retain enough material to do so. But these heavily zinc impregnated aluminum carburetor bodies are extremely hard to drill, and you really cannot drill them. They have to be bored, and they have to be done precisely, or there's no point in even putting it back together. By the time you've spent the money to have that fixed, generally you could just buy a Weber carburetor and put on there and be done. What the tell is the throttle shaft, when just off idle, should have no play in it. This particular one actually is so bad. I don't know if the camera's picking up the step that it's wearing. There it is. Do you see the tiny step down in that bore? Down inside there? That little shiny mark? This is actually hanging up on the bore of the carburetor body because the throttle shaft has play in it. And what that has done is that has ruined this carburetor for even being fixed. There's no point in rebuilding it because you're not going to be able to set it properly because the throttle blade has dug into the carburetor and ruined it. This one I'm going to use because I need to put the car back on the road. But this is a candidate for another carburetor body, and something that you really need to look into when you're putting this back on the road, because no matter how much you tune that car, you'll never be able to tune around that vacuum leak in that throttle shaft. It just can't be done. Let me look at this other one, see if it's worse. I believe this one actually was visible on camera on how bad it rocked. Oh, okay, here we go. Let's see if you can see that throttle shaft play. I'll go slow so you can watch both ends of the throttle shaft. Watch up here too. That movement shouldn't happen at all. This is a solid bore. That thing shouldn't do that. That's what kills most of these carburetors. At this point, again, this is a carburetor that should not be even messed with, because what happens is once you go to start cleaning that, you're going to exaggerate that problem. But for the rest of the video, we're going to go ahead and walk through this. We're going to do it anyway. So that's it for part one. Part two, we're going to be going over the diagnosis of the choke coil, and the operations, how it's supposed to function, how it usually doesn't function, and what you need to do to fix it. Then we're going to go through how to test all of the vacuum stuff, and then I'm going to show you how to clean them out. So stay tuned.